out. The hardiness of the older Indians was remarkable, and also their level of intelligence was high. Indian problems were created by the lack of discipline and chastisement of the children. The tribal pattern remained unchallenged, generation after generation. Among the intermountain tribes, those between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada, the essential group was the band of 15 to 20 people. There was no competing lifestyle for Indian children, no inducement other than the family pattern. Children were not spanked or subjected to any discipline other than the disciplines of survival, food gathering, and, at times, battle. As these children early gained superb skills, I was regularly amazed at the abilities of boys in As these children early gained superb skills, I was regularly amazed at the abilities of boys in craft and survival. I remember once when two young boys, about 8 and 10 years old, went deer hunting. When they had not yet returned after 9 p.m, I voiced my concern, but their grandparents laughed at me. The boys had left at dawn on horseback with a third horse to carry the meat. It was their first hunting trip alone. I drove to the foot of the mountain area where they had gone, hoping to see them before going to bed. It was close to 10 p.m. when I heard them coming. They got their deer early, skinned it, cut up the meat after cooking and it... Cooling it, that's an idea. Wow, that's cool. They got their deer early, skinned it, cut up the meat after cooling it in a stream, and only then started for home. They were amazed and I was worried about them. How could they get lost? If they only dropped the reins, the horses would head for home. A great deal of common sense marked these people. Their weakness was willpower in the face of temptation. Because the child was indulged when hungry or whenever the child demanded something, the child did not cry. He or she had nothing to cry about. Denying or spanking a child, as white Americans did, struck the Indians as heartless. Christian Indians who chastised their children angered their non-Christian relatives. In brief, the child was never frustrated. In Christian civilization, the basic pattern of child rearing has required frustrating the child's self-will and teaching conformity to godly standards in society. The premise for this has been the fall of man. The child is therefore born a sinner, seeking his self-will and desiring gratification. Child training seeks to Christianize and civilize the baby so that it might grow into godly adult. Child training seeks to Christianize and civilize the baby so that it might grow into a godly adult. Not quite right. Child training seeks to Christianize and civilize the baby so that it might grow into godly adulthood. The newborn baby is both helpless and anarchistic by nature. The parents lovingly train the child into godly habits. Because the Indian child rearing was permissiveness. What is that? Why am I making a noise with my mouth? It's crazy. Because the Indian child's rearing was permissive, the Indian child was not used to the frustrations normal to a Christian child's upbringing. The Christian child learns early that there is a pattern to society that requires obedience, conformity, and respect. Lacking this disciplined and purposive training, the Indian child finds the full... Sorry. Lacking this disciplined and purposive training, the Indian child finds life full of frustrations. Overwhelmed, he turns early to liquor and native drugs. As a result, he is unable to develop his often remarkable abilities. Having had a permissive upbringing, he finds life's frustrations overwhelming. He has not learned how to say no to himself or to others. To illustrate, a truly beautiful young Indian woman, after a dance and a few drinks, was persuaded to submit to sexual intercourse. Before this, she had been chaste. The young man then urged her to accommodate his friends, 15 or more of them. She did, unhappily, and went on a drinking binge lasting many days. This young woman was legally an Indian. In reality, she was more than a little white. I perhaps looked more Indian than she did. Her features and complexion would have identified her in any city as probably an Anglo-Saxon. Her problem was not Indian blood. Indian alcoholism has its roots in two facts. First, the permissive character of Indian child rearing gives the young a proneness to drinking as an escape from life's frustrations. Second, certain races have apparently a genetic inability to assimilate alcoholic beverages, whereas others have no such problems. Others who have difficulties with liquor are Northern European peoples. After the end of World War II, and especially after 1953 when I returned to California and white society, I saw the rise of permissive child rearing, and I knew then that white American youth would have serious problems with drinking and drugs. Since then, of course, both liquor and drugs, plus permissive sexuality, have proliferated. Having been reared permissively, Americans cannot take frustration. Life, however, is constantly full of frustrations. These can be met with a flight into liquor, sex, and drugs, or they can be seen as means whereby we learn and grow. Since my years at Auchi, the reservation has gained the unhappy distinction of having the highest suicide rate in the United States. There is, of course, and has been for years, a high rate of suicide among certain tribes. Like the Oriental cultures with stress, fate, so too many Indians represent face cultures. This trait predisposes them to suicide. However, a major factor in the late night. However, a major factor in the late 20th century is the inability to cope. At the same time, suicide has increased greatly among white American youth. In part, this is a byproduct of death education in the state schools. Even more, I suspect, it is due to young Americans' inability to accept frustration and grow because of it. At one time, the major reason for alcoholism had other sources. Among white Americans prior to 1950, a false perfectionism was often a cause even of suicide. Many people wanted their lives to conform to rigid expectations. If their jobs, families, or anything else failed to meet their severe requirements, they fell apart. I recall one beautiful young woman, married to a successful man and the mother of 2 young girls, who required everything around her to resemble a store's show window or an art exhibit. Every room in her spacious house seemed ready for a photographer to chronicle her gracious living. When the girls came home from school and her husband from the office, he hovered over them to pick up and put away the newspaper, school books, and toys. The husband added a recreation room to the house as a place for casual living. The wife at once took charge of the room to make it also a picture-perfect place. Disagreements with her rigid and regimented government of the house and the family caused her headaches, as probably would have Christianity. There is a relationship between permissiveness and false perfectionism. In both cases, people want the world in their terms. One intelligent but alcoholic young Indian man rejected without any hesitation all external standards and requirements in 2 words. Why anything? As a broken culture, Indian life was without the presuppositions which are normally basic to life. Many Indians were far better practicing existentialists than Jean-Paul Sartre. Why anything sums up the problem of many Indians as well as a general white American culture. Well, hope you enjoyed that. That was chapter 8. Octavo. Ocho. Huitième. There you go. Hope to see you in chapter 9. Hello, this is Nathan. Thanks for joining me in the booth. I really hope you're enjoying the live streams and videos. To find out more about this narration project, or to make a donation, go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks. Here we are, chapter 9. Here's the plan. Click, click, record, and narrate. Astounding. 9. The mythical Indian. Preconceived ideas commonly interfere with our ability to see the world and people as they are. Our preconceptions have religious roots. They express our essential faith. The idea of the noble savage has deep roots. Its origin is in pagan antiquity. Many thinkers believed in an original golden age. Civilization had arisen since that time, but at its best could not approximate either the original innocence or the natural fertility and virtue of the world around man. This view had a very This view has a very real resemblance to the biblical account of the Garden of Eden. It is the divergence between the two which is critical. In Scripture, it is man's sin which creates the world of evils. In Scripture, it is man's sin which creates the world of evils in humanity and nature. It is man's will to be his own God and the source of all law and knowledge, Genesis 3:5. In classical thought, no such doctrine as man's desire to supplant God is to be found. Rather, the gods are jealous of man's powers, as with Prometheus. Horace believed in a golden land somewhere which would still manifest the golden age of fertility and happiness. When Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about what came to be known as the noble savage, his thinking gained immediate acceptance because his premises were endemic in non-Christian circles. In fact, generations before Rousseau, such a belief had an extensive influence on Spanish imperial policy. Philip Wayne Powell in Mexico's Miguel Caldera, The Taming of America's First Frontier, 1548 to 1597, 1977, and Tree of Hate, 1971 and 1985, documented this influence very tellingly. The facts of Indian life, including cannibalism in some areas, could not shake the European idealists. Aphra Ben had some experience in the, quote, New World, end quote, in the 17th century, but her belief in the noble savage remained firm in Orinoco, 1688. The mind of the noble savage was seen as a pure mind, one which, without the corruption of Christianity, had attained to a true knowledge of natural religion. Now, natural religion was a construction of the imagination of Enlightenment thinkers. It has never existed in any culture. Supposedly, the noble savage had a pure and natural worship of the Great Spirit, a vague superstition for the Christian God. American Indians supposedly represented this natural religion. Because the Indians courteously and agreeably did not contradict strange questions, but rather expressed a vague assent. Because the Indians courteously and agreeably did not contradict strange questions, but rather expressed a vague assent, scholars assumed that this was proof of the Enlightenment's doctrine. In time, Indians learned that acceptance of certain ideas commended them to those Europeans, so they began to adopt them. The belief in the noble savage living in a state of nature is not only unrealistic, but is also a static idea. It assumes an unchanging and ideal natural culture in which the Indian had always existed. The goal of history was held to be a similarly static condition. Such ideas found focus in Marx's community ideal, the Great Society of John Dewey, and others. But Indian cultures had not been static. For one thing, the horse had dramatically altered Indian life. The first horses were probably those seized by Indians after the disasters of Cabeza de Vacas, circa 1490 to circa 1557 expedition. The horse created shock waves from ocean to ocean. As some tribes gained horses before others, they were able to shatter. As some tribes gained horses before others, they were able to shatter the power of those tribes and drive them out of their usual nomadic migration. Oh, shooter. Oh, what am I doing? It's all gone pear-shaped. Alright, hang on a second here. I'm going to pause it. As some tribes gained horses before others, they were able to shatter the power of those tribes and drive them out of their usual nomadic migrations. Christian civilization has had 20 centuries of history and expansion. All those centuries have been times of change, sometimes great expansion, and often new directions on the premises of the faith. In the 400 years of Indian life known to European first-hand, the changes have been mainly changes. In the 400 years of Indian life known to European first-hand, the changes... European? In the 400 years of Indian life known to Europeans first-hand, the changes have been many also. The reaction of Europeans to that statement is usually, of course, Christian virtues had a shattering effect on the American Indian. True enough, but before the coming of the Europeans, various Indian people... Christian whites. Why is this so hard? The reaction of Europeans to that statement is usually, of course, Christian whites had a shattering effect on the American Indian. True enough, but before the coming of the Europeans, various Indian peoples had shattering effects on one another, sometimes less, sometimes greater than the impact of Europeans. Nothing Europeans have done has equaled, for example, the devastation wrought by the Mayas and later the Aztecs. We must not forget that Cortés could not have succeeded without the help of the non-Aztec peoples. They vastly preferred the Spanish to the Aztecs. This pattern was repeated all over the Americas. This is not all. The various Indian tribes had far less resistance to innovation than do modern America. The various Indian tribes had far less resistance to innovation than do modern Americans. They saw pragmatically what other peoples had and were eager to have it too. They were not chained to particular beliefs or practices. I had known that Indian children in earlier days had been taken from their parents and sent to boarding schools. All the same, I was shocked when one or two of the older men showed me the place near the agency office where their fathers had been shackled in irons until their sons, put into hiding, were surrendered. The men both appreciated my dismay and were a bit amused by it. I was offended by the violation of family life. They told me that they had gone to Carlisle in Pennsylvania and a long way from Nevada, intensely lonely, but in time they found it an exciting new world of experiences and saw things they had never dreamed existed. One interesting urban sight spotted on a trip out of Carlisle, perhaps for an athletic game I do not recall, was an Indian with a monkey and a hurdy-gurdy, or hand organ. Not only was it for them an unusual sight, but the Indian, dark of complexion, seemed almost like an Indian of some other. Dark of complexion seemed almost like an Indian of some other tribe. As a result, Italians were of a real, if minor, interest to these older men. In answer to these In answer to their questions, I said that I had not seen a man with a hurdy-gurdy since the 1920s. These men were curious about Italians in the United States and their progress. An Italian was no longer identified by a hurdy-gurdy and a monkey, so why then should an Indian be identified by what he was a generation or 100 years ago? Some young Indians had already become enamoured of playing the role of a white man's version of the Indian. It had an obvious appeal to white liberals and romantics, and was a good means of getting attention and approval. An Indian delegation to Washington, D.C. and Congress often had an older and semi-senile man dressed as an Indian chief as part of the charade. These old Indians despised the game. They deeply resented any identification of Indians with artifacts out of the past. They relished it when I told them of pagan German and British tribes and their practices. Of particular delight was my account of how the British tribes, when Rome invaded the island, fought naked with their bodies painted. Maybe, one of the Indians said, we should refuse to hear any Indian services official unless he first strips and proves that his ass is painted blue. That's a good one. It's too funny. Those old Indians are gone. Both whites and Indians now play the silly game of Indians play the silly game of identifying people with artifacts from the past. It is an absurdity. It is an absurdity. Sorry. I'm just a little bit difficulty grasping that. I'm going to go back because this bit was a bit pants. You blue ass! Those old Indians are gone. Both whites and Indians now play the silly game of identifying people with artifacts from the past. It is an absurdity neither seems ready to surrender. Okay, that was chapter 99999. So fine. Chapter 9. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you benefited from it. Hope you thought it was nice. So nice. Alright. Okay, so that only leaves me to say goodbye and hope to see you in chapter 10. Okay, here we are, chapter 10. Gonna hit record and let's go. 10. The quote, American, end quote, Indian. Yankee magazine in January 1991 carried an article by James Dodson on Indians titled, Nobody's Laughing at Chief Homer Now. It is about the efforts of, quote, Chief Homer, St. Francis, chief of the sovereign nation of the Abenakis. Chief of the sovereign nation of the Abenakis, end quote. He lays claim to Vermont and more in the name of the Abenakis, or Missisquoi. Or Missisquoi. Their lands, according to Homer, were taken illegally in the colonial era. 2 court decisions have aided his claims. Courts and judges today are very prone to favour, quote, minority rights, end quote, sometimes to a ridiculous degree. Apparently no one raised the issue that the United States did not preempt Abenaki lands. The English did. Of course, in the War of American Independence, the Americans then preempted. In the War of American Independence, the Americans then preempted English lands. If the Abenaki claim is tenable, it should be lodged against the English, who could then file against the Americans. The Abenakis, a particularly brutal people, no doubt seized the lands from earlier inhabitants. But this is not all. Quote-unquote Chief Homer St. Francis, with his English name, looks no more Indian than most Americans walking the streets. He and his people are similar to most Americans of mixed blood. Anthropologist John Greenway has observed, quote, Never in the entire history of the inevitable displacement of hunting tribes by advanced agriculturists in the 40,000 generations of mankind has a native people been treated with more consideration, decency and kindness than the American Indians. The Mongoloids, in displacing the first comers, kindliness, not kindness. Been treated with more consideration, decency and kindliness than the American Indians. The Mongoloids, in displacing the first comers to Asia, the Negros. The Negros, in displacing the Aborigines in Africa, and every other group following the biological law of the competitive exclusion principle, thought like the Polynesian chief who once observed to a white officer, I don't understand you English. You come here and take our lands, and then you spend the rest of your lives trying to make up for it. When my people came to these islands, we just killed the inhabitants, and that was the end of it. End quote. Millions of Americans walking the streets of our cities and working our farms have Indian blood. A very high percentage of all, quote, white Americans, end quote, have Indian ancestors. And a very high percentage of all Indians on reservations have non-Indian ancestors. We do our history an injustice if we fail to take note of this fact. In recent years, it has become a sign of intellectual status to speak contemptuously. In recent It has become a sign of intellectual status to speak contemptuously of, quote, the melting pot, end quote. It is, however, a reality. In my own family, all of whom came from Armenia and Russia from 1915 to 1925, there are now intermarriages with the following peoples: German, Dutch, Scottish, English, Hispanic, and more. The older Shoshone Indians, who remembered the old days well, regarded with amusement and disgust the champions of Indianization. Ironically, these men, who had been forcibly, in some instances, sent to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, came back with some status because of their learning and skills. Parents who had resisted surrendering their sons became proud of them. These boys grew up to be men who read weekly news magazines and daily papers. They knew that life as a hunting people was very meagre. Elder Louis Dave, who as a boy hunted with a bow and arrow as his band roamed over a considerable distance, relished modern life. He knew how poor life and fare are when one must depend on one's hunting, fighting, and food gathering. The myth of the golden age of the Indian past. The myth of the golden age of the Indian past is a myth born of Rousseau. The zeal for the Indian past has been learned by Indians from white Americans. The American tourist hungers for a glimpse of Rousseau's world of primitive innocence and happy, carefree living. There is little interest in an Indian who is a successful cattleman or a university professor, but much interest in an Indian dance. Such dances usually involve fanciful recreations of Indian dress. The title chief is an English and American invention. At first, Indian leaders, often so named by the English without tribal knowledge, were called kings. Later, they were demoted to chiefs. Apt learners, the Indians readily picked up on the cues given to them. They were adept at such things, as well as selling and reselling the same lands to white men. It is a myth to believe that they were innocent and exploited. The white men were similarly looking after their own advantage. I was not only told that chief was an English term, but also that the only comparable term that could be used in either Paiute or Shoshone had reference to a man who headed a war party. Our idea of a chief implies a presiding, governing officer. No such thing existed among most tribes. Many tribes, as hunting and food-gathering peoples, moved about in small family bands. Only occasionally did a large number of bands come together. It is easier to understand Indian life if we think of families. A tribe is an extended family. In our families, there are no officials. Instead, there are parents and children. In a wandering band of 15 or perhaps even 50 Indians, there would be several fathers. Hunting, fishing, and food gathering would determine their movements rather than a general order issued by one man. The Indians were an intelligent people whose learning was directed towards hunting, fishing, and food gathering. Their knowledge of plants was extensive. Thanks to their intelligence, they had no problem in recognizing that the white man had skills, knowledge, and tools that they needed and wanted. The white man was not an, quote, invader, end quotes, in our modern sense. Any Indian from another tribe or another tribe's bands trespassing on their hunting lands was an invader. But invasion was a way of life and often a form of survival. True, the white man looked differently and lived in a very different way, but the older Paiutes and Shoshones regarded the Southwest Indians as very peculiar and did not see them as, quote, Indians, end quote. In fact, they learned from the white man that they were, quote, Indians, end quote. They had no common term for the various peoples of North America. The distinction between whites and Indians was a learned one. Each tribe saw itself as the people. Others had particular names, but not they. An alien could be killed, or he could be adopted and become one of the people. In terms of this, one can perhaps say of the Abenakis today that they represent a minimum of history and a great deal of fiction, a product of American ideas and myths. When we speak of American Indians, we are more accurate than we realize. Like us, they are an American product. Alrighty. I shall spare you narrating the pictures.
This picture that you can't see is a picture. It's very nice.
See you in chapter 11. Well done for listening right to the end. If you would like to know more about this important Christian audiobook project, please go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks.